I was taking the opportunity to catch up on some of my own viewing over the Christmas break, which included watching this video by Growling Sidewinder. I suspect many of you out there know who he is, but if you don't, he flies air combat games like DCS and IL-2 and is really good at explaining air combat theory as he plays, so maybe check him out. Anyway, I was watching one of his recent releases where he flew in a First World War scenario, and as he shot down an ancient looking pusher aircraft, he expressed the following.
Just flying around targets of opportunity, and I see one right here. I don't even know what this thing is. I just know it's not friendly. It looks like a bug. Look at this thing. It's like made of fabric and popsicles. Look at this. Look at that thing. It's like actually made of popsicles, man. What is that? Oh my god.
GS's disbelief at the appearance of pusher aircraft is understandable. As to how modernised, they do look truly bizarre. Mind you, they are still a lot more sensible than the pulpit designs like the Spad SA. Eesh. Because there was a lot of common sense behind the pusher fighter principle, even if ultimately it was eclipsed by the tractor designs. And the aircraft that was the unfortunate victim of Growling Sidewinder is an excellent example of a hugely underrated and poorly remembered aircraft. The Royal Aircraft Factory's F.E.2. Because with aerial warfare developing rapidly through the 4 years of World War I, the F.E.2 was one of the few aircraft that saw frontline combat usage for almost the entire conflict. The origins of this aircraft are a little confusing, so bear with me. In 1909, the British Army's balloon factory was civilianised, and the next year hired a young, I suppose we call him hobbyist, to help them start building these newfangled aircraft to examine their potential utility, with the balloon factory being rebranded as the Royal Aircraft Factory in 1912. The new designer was one Geoffrey de Havilland. You might have heard of him, he did some stuff later. And his first official design for the military was the Farman Experimental 2, named after the French Farman brothers who had pioneered the pusher design. This first F.E.2 flew in 1912 and was even experimentally fitted with a Vickers machine gun at one point. But it was recognised that more could be achieved, and in 1913 an improved F.E.2 was built and test flown in early 1914, though not very successfully. This led to the final design change that produced the true F.E.2, which was built with the idea that it would be an armed reconnaissance aircraft. I should point out that there was basically no common features between the three models other than that they were Farman-style pusher aircraft, so why they persisted in calling them F.E.2, I have no idea. Maybe it was an accounting trick to secure funding. Regardless, the F.E.2 was a pretty respectable aircraft in 1914 when it first flew. A two-seater, the aircraft had the pilot in the rear seat, while the front seat was occupied by the observer/gunner. He was armed initially with a single pintle-mounted Lewis machine gun, which, considering the time, made the F.E.2 extremely well armed. In addition to this, a camera could be mounted alongside the observer to fulfill the role of recon aircraft. Like most other pusher types, the F.E.2 had its tail mounted on booms rather than as part of a solid fuselage, further adding to the appearance of delicacy. But the first models of the F.E.2 had a couple of features that made it far more resilient in service than many contemporaries. A small nose wheel mounted that prevented nose-over events in landing, as well as a sprung landing gear. The first of these new fighting observation aircraft, the F.E.2As, flew on the 26th of January 1915 and entered service with the Royal Flying Corps in May 1915, soon being sent to France to acquire operational experience on the type. These were effectively pre-production aircraft, and the 12 built were initially engined with a green 6-cylinder engine that produced 100 horsepower. They were well liked by their crews, but their low performance meant that as the Germans seemed to avoid engaging the F.E.2As, the pilots and their observers often had the frustrating experience of watching their opponents leaving them behind. So the decision was made that the production aircraft, the F.E.2B, would be fitted with a licensed copy of, ironically, the Austro-Daimler 6-cylinder that was produced by Beardmore and which initially produced 120 horsepower. This was soon developed into a more powerful variant that produced 160 horsepower and which would provide the power plant for the majority of F.E.2 production. In addition to the engine change, the F.E.2B had a number of simplifications made to the design to enable for its easier construction by non-specialist manufacturers and artisans, and 1,557 F.E.2Bs were built, making it one of the most important of the early war Allied aircraft. Unfortunately, problems getting enough Beardmore engines meant that they were slow to get into service, with it being early 1916 before the aircraft started to make their presence felt. In addition to the F.E.2B, there are also a couple of other variants, the 2C and D. The C was intended to act as a night fighter and had the cockpit positions changed around so that the pilot sat forward and had a better view for night flying, but it seems only a couple of these were built before the idea was abandoned. The F.E.2D was built with the more powerful but much heavier Rolls-Royce Eagle 12-cylinder engine and often had an additional fixed machine gun for the pilot to use as well. With 250 horsepower, the F.E.2D had a slightly better top speed and better climb rate and service ceiling than the B, but was inferior in manoeuvrability and on the ground, meaning that only at most a couple of hundred of this type were built. However, despite early issues, both F.E.2Bs and Ds saw plenty of action. Branching out from its original role in armed reconnaissance, the F.E.2 was soon also making a name for itself as a ground attack aircraft, employing bombs strung between its stalky undercarriage. And it was certainly no slouch in aerial combat, especially in the first half of 1916. In mid-1915, the German Flying Corps began fielding the Fokker Eindecker, the first fighter in service with a synchronized machine gun that allowed it to fire through its propeller arc. The Eindecker carved a swathe through the British and French aircraft of the day, setting off the period referred to later as the Fokker Scourge. Generally, history today attribute the end of the Fokker Scourge to the fielding of new single-seat fighters, such as the French Nieuport 11 and the British Airco DH-2, which began fielding in numbers by the late spring of 1916. But often glossed over is the contribution of the F.E.2B, which was also beginning to get into significant frontline service at the same time. Admittedly as a two-seater, the F.E.2, affectionately nicknamed as Fee by its crews, was not as nimble as the newer fighters or the Eindecker, nor quite as quick, with a top speed of just over 90 miles per hour. But with a competent observer/gunner, it was lethal. Take the example of the American double ace Frederick Libby. Libby volunteered with the RFC in 1916, and, in an example practically of the cliché that was serving in air combat in World War I, Libby qualified as an observer gunner on the F.E.2B with No. 23 Squadron on the morning he arrived at the unit and was on flight status by the afternoon. He claimed his first kill on his very first combat mission on the 15th of July 1916, which was coincidentally his 25th birthday. Libby apparently benefited from his upbringing and career as a cowboy, where being a good shot was expected, and which Libby apparently excelled at. One of his first actions as an observer gunner was to have the stocks restored to the Lewis machine guns on his aircraft, which enabled him to fire them much more accurately. And accurate he certainly was, claiming 10 kills in F.E.2Bs, which included a couple of the formidable Albatros D-1 fighters. Indeed, the increasing amount of air combat that the F.E.2s were engaged in saw them rapidly increase their firepower by having a second Lewis gun provided for the pilot. This was on a telescoping mounting that allowed him to fire over the observer's head, but in reality it seems to have been primarily used in a different fashion. Crews found that by raising the pilot's gun to its maximum, it could be used by the observer to shoot back over the top wing, allowing the gunner to shoot at pursuing aircraft. However, this was a somewhat hair-raising affair, as Libby himself explained. When you stood up to shoot, all of you from the knees up was exposed to the elements. There was no belt to hold you. Only your grip on the gun and the size of the nacelle stood between you and eternity. Adjusting and shooting this gun required you to stand right out on the nacelle with your feet on the nacelle coaming. You had nothing to worry about except being blown out of the aircraft by the blast of air or tossed out bodily if the pilot made a wrong move. There were no parachutes and no belts. And in fact, if we look back at Growling's Sidewinder's footage and watch closely, you see the observer stand up as he is attacking the F.E.2 and man the rear firing gun. Kudos to the developers for modelling that little detail, and I think GS may have narrowly escaped being shot in the face, saved by the fact he stayed below the aircraft he was attacking. Because in reality, plenty of pilots of the Central Powers met their end at the hands of the F.E.2B. Famed German ace Max Immelmann, yes, he of the famous aerial manoeuvre, was shot down by F.E.2Bs, while the legendary Red Baron himself, Manfred von Richthofen, was badly wounded in the head in July 1917 after tangling with some F.E.2s. There is a theory, which appeared in the medical journal The Lancet no less, that this injury, which reportedly changed von Richthofen's personality, a classic symptom of brain injury, may have been a contributing factor to his death a few months later. In fact, by the point of Richthofen's injury, the F.E.2s were definitely getting long in the tooth in their original role as armed reconnaissance aircraft. The crews compensated for the improving quality of the German fighters they were facing by utilising a new tactic, the Ley Circle. This saw a formation of F.E.2s fly a horizontal circle, with each aircraft covering the one in front of it from enemy attackers. With the F.E.2Bs and Ds being able to fire both in front and behind them, this manoeuvre meant attackers would be exposing themselves to considerable danger if they attempted a conventional attack. But the Ley is very much a defensive solution for outclassed aircraft, and for daylight operations the now venerable Pusher was fast approaching the end of its usefulness. Indeed, the F.E.2 got some criticism because of its losses during the Second Battle of Arras in 1917. Bloody April, as it came to be known. According to the RAF Museum, of the 275 losses suffered by the RFC during the offensive, more than 70 were F.E.2s. This, along with the generally poor performance of other Pusher aircraft kept in service after they were obsolescent, has marked the aircraft's reputation over the years. But it isn't really justified, as the losses suffered during the Arras offensive were largely due to the RFC not having effective fighters for dealing with their German equivalents, plus that the British were on the offensive and thus casualties were expected to be heavy. Indeed, the Bristol F.2, the aircraft that would replace the F.E.2 in service and which have a good reputation still, suffered heavily in the offensive as well in what was their very first combat deployment. However, the losses meant that there was no denying that the F.E.2s really needed to be replaced. But it was far from the end for the venerable aircraft. They were retasked to night duties, being used as interdictors and attack aircraft, something their steadiness and excellent crew visibility suited them for perfectly. Additionally, they were used for home defence duties on the British Islands, as well as hunting German submarines in the Thames estuary. Thus it was that the archaic-looking aircraft, whose design origins admittedly predated the start of the war, were heavily active right up until the armistice in November 1918. Not a bad record, and one which is all too often overlooked. As is pretty standard with these early aircraft, no complete originals now survive. However, the RAF Museum in Britain have built a recreation using parts of original aircraft that they were able to salvage, which is on display, while the Vintage Aviator in New Zealand, which I believe is owned by Peter Jackson, famous for making the film Bad Taste, and I think some other stuff, has built 2 replicas, one of which is airworthy. Which is great, because the Royal Aircraft Factory F.E.2 is an aircraft that really does not get the commemoration it richly deserves. Hope you found this interesting, thanks for watching, and may I wish you all a Happy New Year.